Hello everyone, a warm welcome back to our dedicated subscribers, and a special greeting to those joining us for the first time. You've just stepped into the perfect place for stories that will haunt your thoughts and leave you staring into the darkness, wide awake. Before we unravel today's eerie tale, share with us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Our community is growing rapidly, and it's thrilling to see just how far our reach extends. And remember, if you want to be among the first to experience our latest spine-chilling uploads, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Without it, you might miss out on the very stories that will keep you up at night. All right, let's dive into today's unsettling adventure. Story 1: The Silent Forest. The forest had always been a place of refuge for me, a sprawling, verdant sanctuary where the pressures of daily life faded into the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of wind through the trees. Nestled on the outskirts of town, the forest stretched for miles, its dense canopy creating a world apart from the concrete and noise of the city. I had hiked its trails countless times, each path familiar and comforting in its own way. But that fall, when the leaves blazed with the fiery hues of autumn and the air carried the crisp bite of the approaching winter, the forest felt different. There was a strange stillness to it, a quiet that went beyond the usual peace, a silence that seemed to press in from all sides, heavy and unsettling. I set out on a familiar trail that afternoon, the sky overhead a muted gray, promising rain. My breath puffed invisible clouds in the cool air, and the forest floor crunched underfoot, the dried leaves and fallen branches creating a soft, uneven carpet. Despite the chill, I felt the familiar thrill of being in nature, of stepping into a space where time seemed to slow and the worries of the world receded. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the distant rustle of small animals were conspicuously absent. It was as if the entire forest were holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. I paused, listening intently, but all I heard was the whisper of the wind through the bare branches. The silence was unsettling, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors that surrounded me. I told myself it was nothing, that the change in weather had simply quieted the forest's usual inhabitants. Still, the further I walked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an irrational thought, one that I quickly dismissed, but the sensation lingered, a prickling at the back of my neck that refused to be ignored. I pushed on, determined to enjoy my hike despite the unease that gnawed at my thoughts. The path wound through the heart of the forest, flanked by towering oaks and maples whose branches intertwined overhead like the archways of a grand cathedral. The ground sloped gently upwards, and soon I found myself at the edge of a small clearing that I had visited many times before. Normally, it was a serene spot, a patch of sunlight amid the shadows where wildflowers bloomed in the spring and deer occasionally grazed. But today, the clearing felt wrong, different, in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The grass, usually a lush green, was brittle and brown, as if touched by an early frost that had bypassed the rest of the forest. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. I stood at the edge of the clearing, hesitating, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I considered turning back, but curiosity propelled me forward. I stepped into the clearing, the dry grass crunching underfoot, and felt an immediate sense of disorientation, as though I had crossed some invisible boundary between the known and the unknown. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree that I had never noticed before. Its bark was dark and twisted, its branches reaching skyward in jagged, unnatural angles that cast long, claw-like shadows on the ground. There was something deeply unsettling about the tree, a sense of wrongness that radiated from it like heat from a fire. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate, as if the slightest misstep might awaken whatever malevolent presence lay dormant within its twisted trunk. As I drew closer, I noticed strange markings etched into the bark symbols and patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. I reached out, running my fingers along the rough surface, and felt a sudden jolt, as though the tree had recoiled from my touch. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the eerie atmosphere of the forest was playing tricks on my senses. But deep down, I knew there was something not quite right about the tree and the clearing in which it stood. I circled the tree, examining the markings more closely. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, a chaotic jumble of lines and shapes that defied logic and pattern. It was as if the tree itself were a canvas for some ancient, indecipherable language, a message written in the twisted script of a forgotten tongue. I reached for my phone, intending to take a photo, but as I raised the camera, the screen flickered and went dark. I tried again, but the phone refused to respond, its display black and lifeless. Frustration mingled with fear as I realized that I was truly alone, cut off from the familiar comforts of modern technology. The wind picked up, swirling through the clearing with a sudden, unnatural force that whipped the dry grass into a frenzy. The branches of the tree creaked and groaned, bending as if under the weight of some invisible pressure. I backed away, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each step. It was no longer a vague feeling, but a palpable presence, a set of unseen eyes that followed my every move. I turned, scanning the forest's edge, but there was nothing, only the darkened silhouettes of trees standing silent and still. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the path back home, but the forest felt different now, its familiar landmarks twisted and unfamiliar. The trail that had been so clear moments before seemed to shift and waver, the trees closing in around me as if conspiring to keep me within their grasp. I started walking, my pace quickening as panic set in. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, drowning out the silence of the forest. Every shadow seemed to stretch and grow, reaching out with long, grasping fingers that brushed against my skin like a cold breeze. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the path winding and twisting in ways that made no sense. The trees, once familiar companions, now loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, a rhythmic drumbeat that matched the frantic pounding of my heart. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the ground uneven and treacherous underfoot. The forest, once a place of solace, had become a maze, a trap from which there seemed no escape. It wasn't until I heard the faint whispering that I truly understood the depth of my predicament. It was soft at first, barely audible over the rustle of leaves, but it grew steadily louder, a chorus of hushed voices that seemed to come from all around. The words were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable and urgent, insistent murmur that filled the air with a sense of dread. I stopped, straining to listen, but the voices overlapped and intertwined, their meaning slipping through my grasp like water through cupped hands. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting wildly between the trees, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, a constant, droning hum that vibrated through the air, through my very bones. It was as if the forest itself were speaking, the voices rising from the ground, from the trees, from the shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the whispering only grew louder, a relentless tide of sound that threatened to drown out my thoughts. I stumbled forward, my steps frantic and uneven, desperate to escape the voices that pursued me through the forest. The path had vanished completely now, replaced by a tangle of roots and brambles that clawed at my legs and pulled at my legs and pulled at my clothes. I could feel the presence behind me, close and relentless, driving me deeper into the forest with each step. The trees pressed in, their branches swaying and creaking, as if in response to some unseen command. Just when I thought I could run no further, I broke through the dense underbrush and found myself at the edge of a small pond. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky above with an eerie clarity. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, the whispering finally fading into the background, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of relief, a sense that I had finally escaped the relentless pull of the forest. But as I looked into the pond, my relief turned to horror. The reflection staring back at me was not my own. It was a face, twisted and contorted, its features unfamiliar and grotesque. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence that sent a chill through my body. I recoiled, scrambling backward, but the reflection remained, watching me with an intensity that felt almost tangible. It moved as I moved, mimicking my actions with a mocking precision that made my skin crawl. I rose to my feet, backing away from the pond, but the reflection followed, its eyes never leaving mine. I turned and ran, the forest blurring around me as I fled, the whispering voices rising once more in a cacophony of sound. I didn't stop until I burst through the tree line and stumbled onto the familiar pavement of the road that led back to town. I collapsed, my lungs burning, the forest looming behind me like a dark, impenetrable wall. I never returned to that trail, nor did I speak of what I had seen. The forest, once a place of refuge and peace, had shown me its darker side, a hidden, unknowable aspect that lurked just beneath the surface. I knew in my heart that the forest was not merely a collection of trees and paths, but a living entity, aware and watchful, its depths filled with secrets that defied understanding. The whispering voices, the twisted reflections, the sense of being watched, they were all part of a larger, incomprehensible whole, a mystery that I would never unravel. I drive past the forest sometimes, catching glimpses of its shadowed interior through the car window. It stands as it always has, silent and unchanging, a constant presence on the outskirts of town, but I know better than to venture inside. I know that some places are not meant to be explored, that some paths lead only to darkness and confusion. The forest is one of those places, a realm of quiet, patient observation, where the line between the seen and unseen blurs, and where the trees whisper secrets best left unheard. Story 2: The House on the Hill. The house on the hill had long been a fixture of local lore, an imposing structure that loomed over the town like a watchful sentinel. Built in the late 1800s, it was a grand Victorian mansion, complete with turrets, ornate balconies, and a vast, sweeping porch that wrapped around the front. But time had not been kind to the old house. Its paint had faded to a sickly gray, and the once immaculate gardens were now a tangled mess of overgrown bushes and weeds. Still, the house stood resilient, weathering the years with a quiet dignity that belied its dilapidated state. Growing up, I had always heard the stories, whispers of strange occurrences and sightings, tales of ghostly apparitions that roamed the halls at night. It was said that the original owners, the Allister family, had vanished without a trace one stormy evening, leaving behind a table set for dinner and a house that would never quite be empty again. Theories abounded: murder, betrayal, some dark secret that had driven the family to madness. But no one knew for sure, and the house remained an enigma, its windows dark and unyielding, a permanent fixture in the town's collective imagination. I had never paid much heed to the rumors, dismissing them as fanciful tales meant to spook children and entertain bored teenagers. But that changed one brisk autumn afternoon when, on a whim, I decided to visit the house for myself. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the sense of adventure that often comes with youth, but something compelled me to climb the winding road that led to the hilltop. The town stretched out below, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and as I approached the house, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The wrought iron gate at the entrance was rusted and hanging askew, its hinges creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open, the sound echoing like a mournful sigh through the overgrown grounds. The path leading up to the house was barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves, and I had to navigate carefully around thorny brambles that snagged at my clothes. As I drew closer, the house loomed larger, its darkened windows watching like the eyes of some ancient creature, indifferent yet aware. I paused at the foot of the steps, taking in the sheer scale of the building. The front door, a massive slab of oak, was adorned with an intricately carved knocker in the shape of a lion's head, its eyes gleaming faintly in the fading light. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the knocker, before deciding to try the door. To my surprise, it swung open with a low groan, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like the growl of some slumbering beast. I stepped inside, the air immediately colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and age. The entryway was grand, with high ceilings and a sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. Dust covered every surface, and the once rich wallpaper was peeling in long, ragged strips, revealing the bare plaster beneath. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant patter of something scurrying through the walls. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom and casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I wandered through the rooms, each one a time capsule of forgotten opulence. There was a parlor filled with dust-covered furniture, a dining room with a grand table still set with tarnished silverware and faded china, and a library whose shelves sagged under the weight of neglected books. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, left exactly as it had been on the day the Alistair family disappeared. The eerie stillness was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something private, something not meant to be disturbed. As I explored further, I found myself drawn to the second floor, the stairs creaking ominously under my weight. The upper hall was lined with portraits, their frames ornate but covered in cobwebs, the faces within staring out with expressions that seemed to change as I moved. One in particular caught my eye, a woman in a dark, elaborate gown, her eyes piercing and intense, as though she were looking straight through me. I paused, feeling a chill as her gaze seemed to follow me down the hall. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, its wood warped and splintered. I pushed it open, revealing a small, cluttered study. Papers were strewn across the desk, yellowed and brittle with age, and an old typewriter sat in the center, its keys coated in a thick layer of dust. A large window dominated the far wall, offering a view of the town below, now bathed in the dusky glow of twilight. I moved closer, peering out at the familiar streets, and for a moment, I felt a sense of disconnection, as though I were looking at a place I no longer belonged to. As I turned away from the window, something caught my eye, a movement in the reflection of the glass. I spun around, expecting to see my own shadow cast by the fading light, but there was nothing there. I glanced back at the window, and my breath caught in my throat. Reflected in the glass was the figure of a man standing in the doorway behind me. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked out of place in the modern world, and his face was obscured by shadow. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the doorway was empty. Panic set in, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. I backed away, my gaze darting between the empty doorway and the window, but the reflection had vanished, replaced by my own wide-eyed expression. I stumbled out of the study, the oppressive silence of the house closing in around me like a vice. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes following me as I retraced my steps, the atmosphere growing thicker, heavier with each passing second. I hurried down the stairs, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I made my way back to the front door. But as I reached the entryway, I heard a soft, distant sound, like the faint strains of music drifting through the air. It was an old melody, something I couldn't quite place, and it seemed to come from the very walls themselves, vibrating through the wood and plaster in a haunting refrain. I froze, listening, my heart thundering in my chest. The music grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from the parlor. I inched toward the doorway, the sound growing clearer with each step. It was a waltz, slow and mournful, the kind of music that might have been played at a grand ball in the house's heyday. The notes hung in the air, ghostly and melancholic, filling the room with a sense of longing that set my teeth on edge. I shone the flashlight into the parlor, the beam sweeping over the dust-covered furniture and faded curtains. There was no one there, but the music persisted, filling the empty space with a presence that was almost tangible. I backed away, my pulse racing, and bolted for the front door. I stumbled down the steps, my foot catching on a loose board, and I nearly fell as I raced across the overgrown lawn. The music followed me, a faint echo that clung to the air even as I put distance between myself and the house. I didn't stop running until I reached the bottom of the hill, breathless and trembling, the house now just a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. I glanced back, half expecting to see a figure standing at the window, watching my retreat. But the house was silent, its windows blank and unresponsive, as though it were mocking my fear. I turned away, the sound of the waltz still echoing in my ears, and made my way back into town, the fading light casting long shadows on the empty streets. I told myself that what I had experienced was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a product of nerves and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house on the hill was more than just an abandoned building. It was a place where the past lingered, where the line between the living and the dead blurred into something intangible and inescapable. In the days that followed, I avoided the hill, steering clear of the road that led up to the house. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the memory persisted, the reflection in the window, the waltz that filled the empty parlor, the sense of being watched by eyes that were no longer there. The house, with its darkened windows and weathered facade, remained a looming presence on the edge of town, a silent witness to the mysteries it harbored within its walls. Occasionally, I would hear others speak of the house, new rumors, new sightings, as though the building were alive and hungry for attention. And each time, I felt that familiar chill, that quiet reminder that some places hold on to their secrets tightly, refusing to let go. The house on the hill was one of those places, a vessel of forgotten histories and lingering spirits, forever trapped in a moment that had long since passed. And so I carried the memory of that day with me, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the past from the present, the known from the unknown. The house remains standing. Watch over the town with a silent, inscrutable gaze, its walls filled with the echoes of lives that will never truly fade. And somewhere, in the darkened halls and shadowed rooms, the waltz continues to play a quiet, unending refrain that speaks of secrets best left undisturbed. Story 3: The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. The lighthouse stood on a craggy, windswept promontory, jutting defiantly into the roiling sea. It had been a beacon of safety for generations, guiding sailors through treacherous waters with its unwavering beam. But over time, the lighthouse had become a relic of the past, overshadowed by modern navigation technologies and left to the relentless assault of salt and storm. Its once pristine white exterior was now weathered and streaked with grime, its windows cloudy with years of neglect. The surrounding cliffs, battered by the relentless waves, loomed dark and foreboding, adding to the sense of isolation that permeated the area. It was here, in this desolate place, that I found myself drawn one bleak November day, driven by a fascination with forgotten places and the secrets they kept. I had heard whispers of the old lighthouse from locals, tales of its last keeper, a solitary man named Elias Granger, who had vanished mysteriously one stormy night nearly 50 years ago. His disappearance had never been explained, and though some speculated he had simply been lost to the sea, others spoke of stranger possibilities, curses, madness, or something far darker. The lighthouse had stood empty ever since, its light extinguished, its purpose forgotten. The only thing that remained were the stories, passed down like a morbid inheritance among the townsfolk who viewed the place with a mix of suspicion and fear. The path leading up to the lighthouse was treacherous, winding through jagged rocks and slick with rain that had fallen earlier in the day. The wind howled through the narrow gaps, carrying with it the scent of brine and decay. I made my way carefully, my footsteps crunching on loose gravel and broken shells, the crashing waves below echoing ominously against the cliffs. The sky was a patchwork of shifting clouds, the sun hidden behind a thick veil that cast the landscape in a muted, oppressive gray. When I reached the base of the lighthouse, I paused, taking in the full scope of the structure. It loomed above me, a solitary tower rising from the rocks, its height exaggerated by the stark emptiness of its surroundings. The door, once painted a vibrant red, was now faded and peeling, hanging slightly ajar as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the rhythmic pounding of the surf, before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The air within was damp and cold, carrying a faint, musty odor that spoke of long neglect. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating the narrow, winding staircase that spiraled up the center of the tower. The walls were covered in patches of mold, and the wooden steps creaked underfoot as I began to ascend. Each step echoed loudly in the confined space, the sound magnified by the silence that pressed in from all sides. The climb seemed to go on forever, the dim light from my flashlight casting erratic shadows that leapt and twisted with every movement. Halfway up, I paused, catching my breath and wiping the damp from my brow. It was then that I noticed something peculiar, a faint sound, barely audible above the relentless howl of the wind outside. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock. I stood still, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come, lost in the steady rush of air through the narrow windows. I dismissed it as the old building settling, the erratic groans of wood and stone that had endured decades of solitude. At the top of the stairs, I emerged into the lantern room, the space that had once housed the great light that guided ships safely to shore. The large, circular lens lay shattered on the floor, shards of glass glittering like fallen stars in the dim light. Rusted machinery stood silent and still, its gears frozen in time. The view from the windows was breathtaking, the vast expanse of the ocean stretching endlessly towards the horizon, the waves churning and crashing against the rocks below. But even here, at the top of the world, the sense of isolation was palpable, the weight of the abandoned tower pressing down with a quiet, unyielding presence. As I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering briefly before plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the switch, my heart racing, and managed to coax the light back on. But in that brief moment of darkness, I had seen something, or thought I had. A shape, faint and indistinct, standing in the corner of the room. It was gone now, the space empty save for the broken lens and rusting metal. But the image lingered in my mind, unsettling and impossible to shake. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and made my way back down the stairs, my footsteps quickening as the unease grew stronger. The lighthouse, once a place of guidance and safety, now felt claustrophobic and oppressive, its walls closing in like the jaws of some great, unseen beast. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard it again, that faint tapping, rhythmic and insistent, echoing up from below. I stopped, my flashlight beam sweeping the narrow staircase, but there was nothing there. The sound persisted, a steady, deliberate beat that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a chill run through me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It was not the random noise of an old building, but something more purposeful, almost like a signal, a message carried on the air. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed the sound to the base of the tower, where a narrow, rusted door led to the keeper's quarters. It was a small, cramped space, filled with the remnants of a life abruptly abandoned. An old bed, a worn desk, shelves lined with nautical charts and faded photographs. The room was dimly lit by a single, grimy window that offered a view of the stormy sea. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting a pale circle of light that danced over the walls, and the tapping grew louder, clearer. I turned towards the source of the sound and froze. On the far wall, just above the bed, hung a large, ornate mirror, its surface streaked with grime and age. The frame was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize, and the glass was cracked in several places, distorting the reflection. But it was not the mirror itself that held my attention, it was what I saw within it. Reflected in the dirty glass was the faint outline of a figure, standing just behind me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in the tattered remnants of a lighthouse keeper's uniform. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt and shadowed, and he stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the mirror. I spun around, the flashlight swinging wildly, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching me with eyes that seemed to pierce through the glass. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, as the tapping grew louder, filling the room with its insistent rhythm. It was then that I realized it was not a sound coming from the building, but from within the mirror itself, a relentless beat that matched the slow, deliberate movement of the figure's hand against the glass. Panic surged through me, and I fled the room, nearly tripping over the threshold in my haste. I ran down the narrow corridor, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the relentless wind that whipped through the cracks in the walls. I burst out of the lighthouse and into the open air, the cold biting at my skin as I raced across the rocky ground. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and trembling, the image of the figure in the mirror seared into my mind. I drove away from the lighthouse, the road winding treacherously along the edge of the cliffs. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the figure from the mirror was watching me even now, its hollow eyes tracking my every move. I glanced in the rearview mirror more than once, half expecting to see him standing on the roadside, but the only reflection was my own pale, frightened face. I never returned to the lighthouse after that day. Whatever secrets it held, whatever had happened to Elias Granger all those years ago, I wanted no part of it. The lighthouse stood as a silent witness to a past that refused to fade, its darkened windows staring out at the sea like the eyes of a ghost. I told myself that what I had seen was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the place. But deep down, I knew that the lighthouse was more than just an old, abandoned building. It was a vessel of memory, a repository of something far older and darker than I could comprehend. The townsfolk still talk of the lighthouse from time to time, their voices hushed and reverent, as though speaking of a sacred, forbidden place. They tell of strange lights that flicker in the tower at night, of faint whispers carried on the wind, of shadows that move behind the glass. And each time I hear their stories, I feel that familiar chill, that quiet reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. The lighthouse remains, standing watch over the restless sea, a testament to the mysteries it guards and the secrets it keeps. And somewhere within its crumbling walls, the figure of the last lighthouse keeper waits, trapped in a reflection that has no end, tapping a relentless rhythm that echoes through the corridors of time. A silent watcher, forever bound to the place he once called home, a ghost of the past that lingers in the shadows, waiting to be seen by those who dare to look. Story 4, The Forgotten Carnival. The carnival appeared without warning, as if conjured overnight by some unseen hand. One morning, the empty lot on the outskirts of town was filled with garish tents and flickering lights, the sounds of distant music carried on the wind. It was an old-fashioned affair, none of the slick, polished attractions of a modern fair, but rather a sprawling, haphazard collection of rickety rides, faded banners, and stalls offering strange, unidentifiable prizes. The townsfolk were intrigued, and by dusk, crowds had begun to gather, drawn by the lure of curiosity and the promise of a fleeting escape from the monotony of daily life. I had always been fascinated by carnivals, their transience, their ephemeral nature, the way they seemed to exist on the fringes of reality. There was something both thrilling and unsettling about them, a sense that they were places where the usual rules didn't apply, where the boundary between the mundane and the magical blurred. But this carnival was different. It had a strange, almost haunted quality, as if it belonged to another time, another place entirely. I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in deep shades of purple and blue. The air was cool, tinged with the sweet scent of spun sugar and the acrid tang of burning kerosene. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I wandered through the entrance, my footsteps muffled by the worn, dusty ground, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The carnival was busy, but there was a strange hush to the crowd, a subdued excitement that felt almost forced. I passed by a series of games, their painted signs chipped and faded, offering prizes that seemed oddly out of place: wooden dolls with lifeless eyes, tarnished jewelry, and strange abstract sculptures that defied description. The barkers called out in low, monotone voices, their pitches half-hearted, their smiles stiff and unnatural. There was a stiffness to everything, as if the entire carnival were a performance being carried out by actors who had long since lost their enthusiasm for the roles they played. I continued on, drawn to a large, weathered tent at the far end of the grounds. It was darker here, the lights dim and flickering, and the tent itself seemed to loom out of the shadows, its fabric faded and frayed, the paint peeling from its wooden supports. A sign above the entrance read the Mirror Maze in letters that had long since lost their luster. I hesitated, the air around me heavy with a sense of foreboding, but curiosity won out. I pulled back the flap and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with an endless series of mirrors that stretched out in all directions, reflecting and distorting the faint light. The floor was uneven, the wooden boards creaking underfoot, and the air was cool and damp, carrying a faint, musty odor. I took a tentative step forward, my reflection multiplying in the mirrors, creating an endless maze of identical images that stretched into the darkness. I moved slowly, one hand outstretched, the other clutching my phone, the dim glow of the screen offering little comfort in the maze's eerie silence. As I ventured deeper, the mirrors seemed to shift, the reflections warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. My own image stared back at me, but there was something wrong, subtle distortions that made my reflection appear taller, thinner, its eyes darker and hollowed. The mirrors were old, their surfaces speckled with grime and cracks that distorted the reflections further, turning familiar shapes into strange, abstract forms. I felt a growing sense of unease, the disorientation of the maze coupled with the eerie quiet creating an oppressive atmosphere that pressed in from all sides. I turned a corner, and suddenly the reflections changed. I saw myself as a child, clutching a faded balloon, my face filled with a wide-eyed wonder that I hadn't felt in years. The image flickered, then shifted again, showing me as an old man, hunched and frail, his eyes clouded with the weight of a lifetime's worth of memories. I stared, transfixed, as the mirrors continued to change, showing me moments of my life that had passed and moments that had yet to come. It was as if the mirrors were alive, sifting through time and memory with an intelligence that defied comprehension. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling, and the reflections shifted once more. Now I saw figures that were not my own people I had never met, their faces unfamiliar but hauntingly vivid. They moved independently of my own actions, turning and staring with expressions of fear, sorrow, and anger. Some reached out as if trying to touch me through the glass, their hands pressing against the surface of the mirrors, leaving ghostly smudges that slowly faded into nothingness. I backed away, my heart racing, the sense of being watched by a multitude of unseen eyes overwhelming. Panic set in as I tried to navigate my way back, but the mirrors seemed to close in, the paths narrowing and twisting in impossible ways. The reflections grew more chaotic, showing images that shifted too quickly to process flashes of distant places, faces I almost recognized, events that felt both real and imagined. It was as if the maze had become a living entity, a sentient labyrinth that was aware of my presence and was toying with me, pulling at the edges of my mind with every step. I turned a corner and froze. Standing directly in front of me, reflected in the glass, was a figure dressed in old-fashioned carnival attire, a tall man with a top hat and a face obscured by shadows. His clothes were tattered and dusty, as though he had stepped out of a forgotten photograph. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto mine through the mirror, and I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me. He lifted a gloved hand, beckoning me forward with a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, expecting to find the figure standing behind me, but the corridor was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone, replaced by my own reflection, wide-eyed and pale. I stumbled backward, disoriented, and bumped into a wall. The mirrors seemed to ripple, the reflections shuddering and shifting as if disturbed by an unseen force. I could hear the faint strains of carnival music, distant and distorted, playing a slow, discordant tune that echoed through the maze. I moved quickly, my steps erratic as I tried to find the exit. The mirrors continued to shift and change, the images flickering between reality and nightmare, blurring the line between what was real and what was real and what was imagined. My heart pounded in my chest, the walls of the maze feeling like they were closing in, the air growing colder with every step. I turned another corner and finally saw the narrow flap of the entrance, the faint glow of the carnival lights just beyond. I pushed through, stumbling out into the open air, the cool night a welcome contrast to the stifling confines of the maze. I leaned against a nearby post, catching my breath, my mind racing with what I had seen. The carnival was still bustling, the lights flickering, the rides creaking and swaying in the breeze. But something had changed. The crowd seemed thinner, the barkers quieter, their voices barely rising above a whisper. It was as if the entire carnival had taken on the same strange, haunted quality as the maze, a place that existed on the fringes of reality. I left without looking back, my footsteps quickening as I made my way through the grounds and out to the main road. The music continued to play, the faint, discordant melody following me like a distant echo. I didn't stop until I reached the familiar streets of town, the warmth of the streetlights and the hum of distant traffic a welcome relief from the eerie quiet of the carnival. The next morning, the carnival was gone. The lot where it had stood was empty, the trampled grass and scattered litter the only evidence that it had ever been there. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where it had gone or who had brought it to town in the first place. It was as if it had never existed, a fleeting specter that had appeared and vanished without a trace. I couldn't shake the memory of the mirrors, the shifting reflections, the figure in the top hat who had watched me from the glass. It was as if the carnival had shown me something, some hidden truth, some secret that lay buried deep within the fabric of the world. I tried to forget, to convince myself that it had all been an elaborate trick, a clever illusion crafted by some masterful showman. But the memory lingered, a quiet reminder of the strange, unsettling place I had wandered into on that cool autumn evening. Years later, I still think of the carnival whenever I see an empty lot or hear the faint strains of an old, familiar tune. It's as if the place is still out there, somewhere on the fringes, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in and lose themselves in its endless, shifting halls. And though I have no desire to return, I can't help but wonder what I might find if I did, what secrets lie hidden in the shadows, what reflections wait behind the glass. The carnival remains a mystery, a fleeting specter on the edge of memory, forever etched into my mind as a place where the lines between reality and illusion blur, where time and space twist and bend, and where the mirrors never show quite what they seem. And somewhere in that forgotten maze, the figure in the top hat waits, a silent guardian of secrets best left undiscovered, beckoning to those who dare to look too closely into the darkened glass. Story 5, The Haunting of Room 214. The hotel had stood on the outskirts of the city for nearly a century, a grand, imposing structure that loomed above the surrounding buildings like a watchful guardian. It was once a place of elegance and luxury, frequented by society's elite who came to revel in its opulence and marvel at its Art Deco design. But time had not been kind to the old hotel. Its grandeur had faded, its marble floors scuffed, and its ornate chandeliers dulled by decades of dust. The wallpaper, once vibrant, now peeled in long, curling strips, revealing the cracked plaster beneath. Yet, despite its decline, the hotel retained a certain allure of faded, melancholic beauty that spoke of a past long gone. I had checked in late, tired from a long drive and eager for nothing more than a hot shower and a quiet night's rest. The lobby was nearly empty, save for a weary receptionist who barely looked up as I signed the register. The lighting was dim, casting shadows that stretched along the walls like dark, elongated fingers. I couldn't help but feel a sense of disquiet, a subtle tension that lingered in the air like the faint scent of mildew. The hotel was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in and makes the ears strain for any sound, however faint. I was assigned room 214, a corner room at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As I made my way down the corridor, my footsteps echoed softly against the worn carpet. The pattern faded and threadbare. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames tarnished and glass smudged, capturing moments of the hotel's past splendor. Elegant couples in evening attire, musicians playing in grand ballrooms, sunlit gatherings on the rooftop terrace, all images of a time when the hotel had been alive with laughter and light. When I reached room 214, I hesitated. The door, painted a dull, faded green, seemed oddly foreboding. The number, barely visible in the dim light, was missing a digit, only a faint outline of where the 4 should have been. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the building's overall neglect, and unlocked the door. The room was small, with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that looked out over the city, its lights twinkling faintly in the distance. It smelled faintly of stale air and something else, something faintly sour that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged off the unease and set my bag down, eager to settle in for the night. The first sign that something was amiss came shortly after I lay down. The bed, though neatly made, felt strangely lumpy, the springs creaking loudly with every movement. I adjusted the pillows and settled in, but sleep did not come easily. There was a persistent noise of faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from the walls, like the soft drumming of fingers against wood. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building settling, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing minute. It was unnerving, the steady cadence gnawing at my nerves, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, wide awake and growing increasingly agitated. I got up, pacing the small room in an attempt to shake off the restless energy that had settled over me. The tapping continued, a relentless, rhythmic beat that seemed to pulse through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to locate the source, but it was as if the sound was coming from all directions at once, enveloping me in a cocoon of noise. I knocked on the wall, hoping to disrupt the rhythm, but the tapping only paused for a brief moment before resuming, as steady and insistent as before. Growing frustrated, I left the room and wandered down the hallway, hoping the change of scenery would calm my nerves. The corridor was empty, the lighting dim and flickering, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move as I passed. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, but the doors remained stubbornly closed. A sign hung on the wall, its message barely legible out of order. With a sigh, I turned back, resigned to returning to my room. As I walked, I noticed something peculiar. The walls, lined with old photographs, seemed different, somehow subtler, darker. The faces in the pictures, once cheerful and animated, now appeared solemn, almost mournful, their expressions somber. I could have sworn that some of the faces were turned slightly, as if watching me with unblinking eyes. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and the unsettling images. The tapping resumed as I approached room 214, louder now, a sharp, staccato rhythm that set my teeth on edge. I opened the door and froze. The room was no longer as I had left it. The bed, once neatly made, was in disarray, the sheets twisted and the pillows thrown to the floor. The window, previously closed, was now open, the thin curtains fluttering in the breeze that carried the faint sounds of the city below. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, the tapping now deafening, reverberating through the walls like the steady beat of a drum. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there, only the empty bed, the open window, and the relentless noise that filled the space. I approached the window, peering out into the night. The city stretched out before me, a sea of twinkling lights and distant movement, but there was something off about the view. The streets below were deserted, the buildings dark and lifeless, as if the entire city had been abandoned. I turned back to the room, the tapping now accompanied by a low, whispering sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The whispers were faint, just on the edge of hearing, but they carried a tone of urgency, a desperate, pleading quality that sent a chill through my bones. I grabbed my bag, my mind racing, and bolted for the door. I had no desire to spend another minute in room 214, the sense of unease now a full-blown panic. But as I reached for the doorknob, it turned in my hand, the door swinging open of its own accord. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the door slowly close, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence. I tried to open it again, but the knob refused to turn, the door stubbornly locked. I was trapped. The tapping grew louder still, a cacophony of sound that filled the room and drowned out all other noise. I covered my ears, the relentless beat reverberating through my skull, and backed away, my eyes scanning the room for any means of escape. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices that overlapped and intertwined, their meanings lost in the jumble of sound. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed, and fell to the floor. As I looked up, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, just out of reach of the dim light. It was tall and indistinct, its form shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes, though shadowed, glinted faintly, two pinpricks of light that stared unblinkingly in my direction. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. The figure remained motionless, watching me with an intensity that felt almost tangible, its presence a heavy weight that pressed down on my chest. I scrambled to my feet, my hands fumbling for the light switch, but the room remained stubbornly dark. The figure didn't move, its gaze unwavering, the hum growing louder and more insistent. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and tried the door again, pulling with all my strength. The knob twisted, the door swinging open with a sudden, violent force that sent me stumbling into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I reached the lobby, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind a whirl of fear and confusion. The receptionist glanced up, her expression unreadable, as I stumbled towards the desk. "I need to check out," I stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. She nodded, unfazed, and silently handed me the receipt. I didn't look back as I fled the hotel, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of room 214. As I drove away, the tapping and whispers still echoed in my mind. The figure's shadowy form burned into my memory. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, telling myself it was just exhaustion, the product of a tired mind in an unfamiliar place. But deep down, I knew there was more to it, that room 214 held secrets I was never meant to uncover. I later learned that I was not the first to flee that room in the dead of night. The hotel, it seemed, had a reputation, one that the staff rarely spoke of, but that lingered in hushed conversations and knowing glances. Room 214 was said to be haunted, the site of a tragic event that had occurred decades ago, when a guest had met a violent end within its walls. The details were murky, lost to time and fading memories, but the stories persisted, a quiet reminder of the shadows that lingered in the old hotel's corridors. The hotel still stands, its facade a fading testament to a once glorious past, its rooms rarely filled except by the occasional traveler unaware of its history. And room 214 remains, a silent witness to whatever tragedy unfolded there all those years ago. I never returned, but the memory of that night stays with me, a reminder of the thin line that separates the ordinary from the inexplicable, the seen from the unseen. And somewhere, in the dim light of a quiet night, the tapping continues, a relentless beat that echoes through the walls, accompanied by the faint whispers of voices long silenced. A testament to a presence that refuses to fade, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting guest to cross its threshold. Story 6: The Watcher in the Woods. There's a stretch of woods just outside my hometown, thick with towering pines and tangled underbrush, that has long been the subject of local legend. The forest is vast and uninviting, the kind of place that seems to absorb light and sound, muffling the outside world beneath its dense canopy. The older generation spoke of it with a mix of reverence and fear, warning against venturing too deep, especially after dark. They told tales of a presence that lurked among the trees, something ancient and watchful, something that was best left undisturbed. As children, we dismissed these stories as nothing more than cautionary tales meant to keep us from wandering where we shouldn't. But as I grew older, I found myself drawn to the forest's quiet, shadowed depths, intrigued by the mysteries it seemed to conceal. It was late autumn when I finally decided to explore the woods alone. The days were growing shorter, the crisp air filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. I had walked the outer edges of the forest many times, sticking to the familiar trails that wound through the pines, but I had never ventured far from the beaten path. That day, driven by a restless curiosity, I set out with a thermos of coffee and a sense of determination, eager to see for myself what lay beyond the familiar. The sun was already low in the sky as I entered the forest, the light slanting through the branches in thin, golden rays. I followed a narrow trail that snaked between the trees, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became, the sounds of civilization fading into the background, replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional rustle of a startled animal. There was a stillness to the air, a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural quiet of the woods, but the feeling persisted, a quiet unease that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I walked for what felt like hours, the trail growing fainter with each step until it was little more than a vague suggestion beneath the undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, their branches entwining overhead to form a canopy so dense that only the faintest glimmers of sunlight filtered through. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, long and dark, shifting with every movement of the wind. I paused to take a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth as I leaned against a tree and listened to the quiet. It was then that I first felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit underbrush, but there was nothing. The forest was empty, the only movement the gentle sway of branches in the breeze. I shrugged it off and continued walking, though the feeling of unease remained, a constant presence just at the periphery of my awareness. As I pressed on, the woods seemed to close in, the trees crowding together as if conspiring to block my path. The air grew colder, carrying a faint, acrid scent that I couldn't quite place. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, its edges lined with thick brambles and twisted roots that snake across the ground like the veins of some ancient, slumbering creature. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, weathered and covered in moss, its surface etched with markings that were too faded to decipher. I approached cautiously, the unease now a palpable tension that thrummed in the air. The stone had a strange, almost magnetic quality, as if it were drawing me in, compelling me to reach out and touch its cold, rough surface. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the stone, and that's when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden among the trees. It was tall and slender, its silhouette barely discernible in the fading light. For a moment, I thought it was just another tree, its form blurred by the shadows, but then it moved. A slow, deliberate shift, as if it were adjusting its stance, watching me from the cover of the forest. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I called out, my voice sounding small and strained in the stillness. "Hello? Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its shape indistinct and shadowed, like a dark smear against the backdrop of the trees. A sense of dread washed over me, a visceral, instinctive fear that gripped my chest and refused to let go. I took another step back, my eyes never leaving the figure, and for a moment I considered turning and running. But something kept me rooted in place, a morbid curiosity or perhaps the sheer disbelief that I was not alone. The figure remained motionless, its presence unnervingly calm amid the growing darkness. I blinked, and in that brief moment, it was gone, vanished as suddenly and silently as it had appeared. I scanned the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of it. The woods were empty once more, the shadows long and undisturbed. I tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, but the fear that clung to me was real, a cold, unrelenting certainty that I was not alone. I turned and made my way back the way I had come, my pace quickening as the light continued to fade. The forest, once so familiar, now felt alien and hostile, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood, sent a fresh jolt of fear through me, my senses heightened to every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. I retraced my steps as best I could, the path twisting and turning in ways that made no sense, the landscape shifting as if trying to lead me astray. It was nearly dark by the time I stumbled onto the main trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands trembling with cold and fear. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the path, watching my retreat. But there was nothing, only the darkened outlines of trees and the faint rustle of the wind. I hurried on, eager to put distance between myself and the clearing, the stone, the figure that had watched from the shadows. When I finally emerged from the woods, the sky was a deep, inky blue, the first stars just beginning to twinkle overhead. I made my way home in a daze, my thoughts racing, my mind replaying the events of the afternoon in an endless loop. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, that I had trespassed into a place that was not mine to explore. The figure in the woods, whatever it was, had not been an animal nor a trick of the light. It had been real, and it had been watching me. Over the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, to dismiss it as the result of fatigue and overactive imagination. But the memory lingered, a persistent shadow that haunted my thoughts and colored my dreams. I found myself avoiding the forest, taking longer routes to bypass the trails that led to its depths. Even the sight of the treetops swaying in the distance sent a chill through me, a reminder of the watcher that lurked among the shadows. The townsfolk, when I asked, were tight-lipped, their expressions guarded. They spoke in vague terms of the forest's history, of old superstitions and strange sightings that had persisted for generations. There were stories, they said, of people who had gone missing, of lights seen among the trees at night, of whispers that carried on the wind. It was said that the forest was alive, that it had a consciousness of its own, and that those who ventured too far often found themselves lost, both in body and in mind. I couldn't help but wonder what I had encountered that day, whether it was the ghost of someone who had wandered too far, or something older, something that had always been there, lurking just beyond the reach of human understanding. The figure had been watching, not with malice, but with a cold, detached curiosity, as if observing a trespasser in its domain. It had not followed, had not pursued, but its presence had been unmistakable, a quiet reminder that the woods held secrets far beyond the grasp of those who dared to enter. The forest remains, a dark, sprawling expanse that stretches along the town's edge, its depths shrouded in mystery and shadow. I have not returned, nor do I plan to, but I still think of the figure sometimes, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching from the cover of the trees. I can still feel the weight of its gaze, the cold certainty that I was not alone. And though the forest calls to me with its quiet, shadowed allure, I know better than to answer. For the watcher is still there, waiting in the depths of the woods, unseen and patient. And the forest, with its tangled branches and darkened paths, remains a place of secrets that are better left undisturbed, whispered only in the quiet moments when the wind rustles through the leaves and the shadows stretch long and dark across the forest floor. Story 7, The Enigma of the Abandoned Train Station. The old train station had been abandoned for as long as anyone in town could remember. It sat on the outskirts, beyond the tangled maze of rusted tracks and overgrown weeds, a relic of a bygone era when steam engines chugged their way through the countryside, carrying passengers and cargo to destinations near and far. The station was grand in its day, with a sweeping roof of iron and glass, intricate stonework, and tall, arched windows that once gleamed in the sunlight. But time had reduced it to a decaying husk, its facade cracked and stained, its windows shattered and gaping like the hollow eyes of a skull. The tracks, once a lifeline to the outside world, were now choked with brambles and refuse, the steel rails twisted and broken. I had always been drawn to places like the old station, forgotten spaces that seemed to exist on the fringes of reality, places where the past clung stubbornly to the present, refusing to let go. There was something about the station that captivated me, an eerie beauty that called out to my sense of curiosity and adventure. I often found myself wandering its crumbling platforms, the air thick with the scent of rust and mildew, my footsteps echoing softly in the silence. It was a place of quiet contemplation, where the noise of the outside world faded into the background, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind and the distant, ghostly sound of a long-departed train. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the first hints of twilight crept across the landscape, I decided to explore the station more thoroughly. The air was cool, carrying the faint tang of rain on the horizon, and the sky was a patchwork of gray and orange, the clouds tinged with the last light of the day. I approached the station with a sense of purpose, my camera in hand, determined to capture the elusive spirit of the place, to document its slow decay and the stories etched into its crumbling walls. The main entrance, once grand and imposing, was now little more than a gaping archway, the doors long gone, leaving only splintered wood and rusted hinges. I stepped inside, my footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris, the air heavy with dust that danced in the slanting beams of sunlight. The main hall was vast, its vaulted ceiling towering above like the ribcage of some great, slumbering beast. Pigeons roosted in the rafters, their soft cooing echoing through the empty space. The ticket counters, once bustling with activity, were now covered in grime, their surfaces littered with old newspapers and scraps of forgotten luggage tags. I wandered through the hall, my camera clicking softly as I captured the decaying grandeur of the space. I moved towards the platforms, the floor uneven beneath my feet, the tracks below filled with stagnant water and tufts of grass that swayed gently in the breeze. The platforms were lined with benches, their wood splintered and warped, and the old lamps that once lit the way for travelers now stood dark and rusted, their glass shades cracked or missing entirely. I paused, taking in the desolation, the sense of time frozen in place, as if the station were holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. It was then that I noticed the first oddity of faint, rhythmic tapping, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. It was a soft, metallic sound, like the distant echo of a hammer striking metal, or the steady tick of a clock that had long since lost its rhythm. I turned, scanning the area, but there was no one there, only the empty platforms and the shadows that stretched long and dark across the ground. I tried to dismiss the sound as the result of the building settling, the natural creaks and groans of old wood and stone, but it persisted, growing louder, more insistent, as if calling out to me from the depths of the station. Curiosity piqued, I followed the sound, my footsteps leading me deeper into the station's bowels, down a narrow, dimly lit corridor that ran parallel to the tracks. The air grew colder as I descended, the walls damp and slick with moisture, the faint scent of mold and decay mingling with the acrid tang of rust. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, echoing off the walls in a dissonant chorus that set my nerves on edge. I rounded a corner and found myself in front of a door, its surface marred by scratches and peeling paint, the number 6 barely visible above the frame. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, a sudden, inexplicable sense of foreboding washing over me. The tapping was louder now, a steady, relentless beat that reverberated through the door, the sound almost hypnotic in its persistence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and turned the knob. The door creaked open with a groan, the hinges protesting as I pushed it aside and stepped into the room beyond. The space was small, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light over the scene. It was an old storage room filled with rusted tools, broken crates, and stacks of rotting timbers. But what caught my attention was the far wall, a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and fogged with age, reflecting the dim light in distorted, fractured shards. The tapping was louder here, the sound emanating from the mirror itself, as if something were trapped behind the glass, desperately trying to get out. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The mirror was massive, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, grimy surface, and the tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an unnerving silence. I stared into the mirror, my own reflection barely visible through the grime and cracks, and felt a strange, inexplicable pull, as if the mirror were drawing me in, urging me to look deeper. It was then that I saw a flicker of movement just beyond the surface, a shadow that darted across the fractured glass. I stepped back, my heart racing, the sense of being watched overwhelming. The shadow moved again, this time closer, its form vague and indistinct, like a dark stain spreading through the glass. I blinked, and in that brief moment, the shadow took shape a figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the cracks, but unmistakably human. It stood still, watching me from the other side, its eyes hollow and dark, filled with an unsettling, quiet intensity. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rusted toolbox in my haste. The figure remained, its gaze locked onto mine, unblinking and unmoving. I turned and bolted from the room, the door slamming shut behind me with a deafening crash that echoed through the empty station. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing wildly, the walls closing in as the tapping resumed, louder and more frantic than before. I didn't stop until I burst out onto the platform, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the station's interior. I stood there, breathless and shaking, the station looming behind me like a dark, forbidding specter. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a nightbird. I glanced back at the entrance, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, watching my retreat. But there was nothing, only the empty archway and the darkened windows, staring out like empty eyes. I made my way back to the main road, my mind reeling with what I had seen. The station, once a place of transit and connection, now felt like a trap, a labyrinth of forgotten memories and lost souls. The figure in the mirror, the relentless tapping, the shadows that flickered just beyond the edge of sight, it was as if the station were alive, aware, and reaching out to anyone foolish enough to venture too close. I never returned to the station after that day. Whatever secrets it held, whatever had caused the tapping and the figure in the mirror, I wanted no part of it. The station remains, a crumbling monument to the past, its platforms empty and its tracks silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind. But the memory lingers, a quiet reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, the seen from the unseen. And somewhere within its decaying walls, the mirror still stands, its surface cracked and fogged, a silent witness to whatever watches from the other side. The tapping continues, a relentless beat that echoes through the corridors of time, a call from a place where the past refuses to fade, where shadows linger and forgotten voices speak in the language of echoes. Story 8, The Portrait of the Unknown Woman. The gallery was tucked away on a quiet street in a forgotten corner of the city, a place where the old and the new collided in a jumble of crumbling facades and sleek, modern storefronts. It was small and unassuming, its sign faded and half covered by creeping ivy, the kind of place you could walk past 100 times without ever noticing. But on that gray, rain-soaked afternoon, as I wandered aimlessly through the city's winding streets, it caught my eye. Something about the way it seemed to huddle against the surrounding buildings, its windows dark and impenetrable, piqued my curiosity. I was in no hurry, with hours to kill and nowhere particular to be, so I decided to step inside. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with a mismatched assortment of paintings that spanned a wide range of styles and periods. It was clear that the gallery was not a place of high renown. There were no famous names, no crowds of art enthusiasts, just a scattered collection of works that seemed to have been assembled with little rhyme or reason. The air was cool and slightly musty, carrying the faint scent of old wood and varnish, and the only sound was the soft creak of floorboards beneath my feet as I wandered through the narrow space. I moved from painting to painting, each piece telling its own quiet story. There were landscapes, serene and pastoral, their colors muted and faded with age. Portraits of stern-faced gentlemen and delicate ladies, their expressions frozen in time. Still lifes of flowers and fruit, rendered with meticulous detail yet somehow devoid of life. It was an odd, eclectic mix, and I found myself both intrigued and vaguely unsettled by the assortment of forgotten works that adorned the walls. It was at the far end of the gallery that I found a large, imposing portrait that seemed entirely out of place among the other, more conventional pieces. The painting was dark and moody, the background a swirling mass of shadow and indistinct shapes that gave the impression of depth and movement. At its center was the figure of a woman, seated in a high-backed chair, her posture rigid and her gaze fixed directly ahead. She was dressed in a flowing gown of deep, muted colors, her hair pulled back in an elaborate style that spoke of a time long past. Her features were striking high cheekbones, piercing eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved, and a faint, enigmatic smile that was neither warm nor inviting. There was something deeply unsettling about the portrait, an almost palpable sense of presence that seemed to radiate from the canvas. It was as if the woman were not merely a figure rendered in paint, but a living entity trapped behind the layers of oil and varnish. Her eyes, dark and unfathomable, held a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there for several minutes, transfixed, unable to tear myself away from her gaze. There was no plaque or label to identify the artist or the subject, no indication of when or where it had been painted. It was as though the portrait had simply appeared, unbidden and unclaimed, a fragment of some forgotten past that had found its way into the present. I turned to the gallery owner, a thin, elderly man who had been watching me with mild interest from behind the counter. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet space. He looked at me for a long moment before shrugging, his expression unreadable. "No one knows," he said finally, his voice tinged with the faintest hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. The painting was part of a lot purchased from an estate sale many years ago. There were no records, no information. It's been here ever since, waiting. Waiting for what I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know. The owner shrugged again, his eyes drifting to the portrait. "Perhaps for someone to remember her," he said softly, almost to himself. "Or perhaps for someone to forget." I left the gallery soon after, the woman's gaze lingering in my mind as I stepped back out into the rain. The city was quiet, the streets slick with water, and I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts occupied by the strange, unsettling portrait. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something just beyond the reach of understanding. Her eyes had seemed so real, so alive, as if they held the secrets of a lifetime locked away behind their painted depths. That night, I dreamed of the portrait. I was standing in the gallery, the walls closing in around me, the other paintings fading into darkness. The woman was there, her gaze fixed on mine, her expression unreadable. She seemed to grow larger, the shadows behind her shifting and writhing like living things. I felt a strange pull, as though I were being drawn into the painting, into the swirling depths of shadow that surrounded her. Her eyes bore into me, cold and knowing, and I woke with a start, my heart racing. The image of her face burned into my mind. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the gallery again and again, drawn by some inexplicable compulsion to see the portrait once more. Each time, the woman's gaze seemed to grow more intense, more piercing, as though she were trying to communicate something, to reach out from the confines of the canvas. I spoke with the gallery owner on several occasions, pressing him for any information he might have uncovered, but he had none. The portrait remained a mystery, its origins and subject unknown. It wasn't long before I began to notice changes in myself. My sleep became restless, plagued by vivid dreams in which the woman appeared again and again, her eyes following me through scenes that shifted and warped like reflections in a dark pool. I felt a growing sense of unease, a heaviness that settled over my thoughts and clouded my days. I lost track of time, my work suffered, and I found myself avoiding social interactions, preferring the quiet solitude of my apartment where I could think, or rather, not think about the woman in the portrait. One evening, driven by a restless energy I couldn't explain, I decided to do some research of my own. I pored over old books, scoured online archives, and delved into the records of long-forgotten art auctions, searching for any clue that might shed light on the painting's origins. But I found nothing, no mention of the artist, no records of the woman's likeness, no hints as to where the portrait had come from or who she might have been. It was as though the painting existed outside of time, a ghostly fragment of a world that no longer existed. As the weeks went on, the dreams grew more intense, more insistent. I saw the woman everywhere in reflections, in the patterns of shadows cast by streetlights, even in the faces of strangers passing by. Her eyes haunted me, their cold, unblinking stare a constant presence at the edge of my vision. I began to avoid mirrors, unable to shake the feeling that I would see her standing just behind me, her expression inscrutable, her eyes fixed on mine. It was on a rainy night, not unlike the one on which I first discovered the gallery, that I made my final visit. The city was quiet, the streets empty save for the occasional splash of headlights cutting through the downpour. I arrived at the gallery just as it was closing, the owner already locking up for the night. He looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and resignation, as though he had been expecting me. "She's waiting for you," he said simply, gesturing towards the portrait at the far end of the gallery. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of inevitability, as though I were walking towards something that had been set in motion long before I had ever set foot in the gallery. The portrait was as I remembered it, the woman's eyes fixed on mine, her expression calm, yet somehow accusatory. I stepped closer, my reflection merging with hers in the glass that covered the canvas. For a moment, I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as though the ground were shifting beneath my feet, the walls closing in. Her eyes seemed to change, the faint smile fading, replaced by a look of sadness, or perhaps recognition. I reached out, my hand brushing against the surface of the painting, and felt a shock of cold that shot through my fingers and up my arm. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the gallery spinning around me. The woman's eyes seemed to follow, her gaze unbroken, as if she were watching not just me, but something beyond, something just out of sight. I turned and fled, the rain pelting my face as I ran through the darkened streets, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the downpour. I never returned to the gallery after that night. The dreams gradually faded, and the woman's gaze became a distant memory, a shadow that lingered at the edges of my mind but no longer dominated my thoughts. I moved on, or at least tried to, but the memory of the portrait remains a quiet, unsettling reminder of a brush with something I could neither understand nor explain. The gallery, I later learned, closed not long after my final visit. The paintings were sold off, the space repurposed, the building renovated into a sleek, modern office. But the portrait of the unknown woman was never found. It had vanished, as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind save for the faint, lingering sense of presence that had haunted the gallery's dimly lit walls. And somewhere, I. Imagine she still waits, her eyes fixed on the future, or perhaps the past, watching and waiting for someone to remember or to forget. Story 9, The Forgotten Library. The library was an anomaly, a sprawling, Gothic structure nestled incongruously among the sleek, modern buildings of the city's business district. It was a place of shadows and whispers, where time seemed to stretch and bend, slipping through the cracks in the marble floors and gathering in the corners like a fine, undisturbed dust. Most people hurried past it without a second glance, dismissing it as an architectural relic, a leftover from a bygone era when such places were revered as temples of knowledge and learning. But I had always been drawn to it, captivated by its silent, brooding presence, the way it stood defiantly against the encroaching tide of glass and steel. It was on a rainy afternoon, the sky a uniform sheet of gray and the streets slick with water, that I found myself standing before its heavy, iron-bound doors. I had passed the library countless times, always intending to explore its depths, but never quite finding the moment. Today, though, something compelled me to push open the doors and step inside, leaving the noise and bustle of the city behind. The air within was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old paper and leather, and the dim light that filtered through the high, stained glass windows bathed the interior in a muted, ethereal glow. The library was vast, its ceiling soaring high above, supported by columns of dark, polished stone that gleamed faintly in the half-light. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the distance, filled with books of every size and color, their spines worn and faded, their pages yellowed with age. The silence was profound, a heavy, almost tangible presence that seemed to press down from all sides. It was the kind of quiet that made you acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat, as though the very act of existing within such a space was an intrusion. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers lightly along the spines of the books, each one a promise of forgotten knowledge and hidden stories. The titles were an eclectic mix, some familiar, others written in languages I couldn't even begin to decipher. There were tomes on history, philosophy, and science, but also stranger works, grimoires of occult knowledge, treatises on alchemy and the supernatural, their pages filled with intricate diagrams and cryptic symbols. It was as if the library were a repository of the world's lost and forbidden knowledge, a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blurred. As I explored further, I noticed that the library was far larger than it appeared from the outside. The aisles seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, leading to new rooms and hidden alcoves that defied any logical sense of space. I passed through archways that opened into grand reading halls, their ceilings adorned with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from mythology and legend. I descended narrow, spiral staircases that wound deep into the earth, the air growing colder and the light dimmer with each step. It was a labyrinth of books and shadows, a place that seemed to exist outside of time, where the past lingered like a forgotten melody. It was in one of these lower levels, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and the faint, metallic tang of old metal, that I found the room. It was small and unassuming, tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor, its door slightly ajar. A faded sign above the entrance read Archives, the letters barely visible beneath a layer of dust. I pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a low, drawn-out creak, and stepped inside. The room was cluttered and dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of countless volumes. Piles of loose papers and old maps covered the tables, their edges curling and yellowed, the ink faded and smudged with age. At the center of the room stood a large wooden desk, its surface strewn with an assortment of quills, inkwells, and other writing implements that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. But what caught my attention was the book that lay open on the desk, its pages illuminated by a single, flickering candle that cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. The book was unlike any I had seen before. Its cover was bound in a dark, cracked leather that seemed to absorb the light, its surface embossed with strange symbols that glinted faintly in the candle's glow. The pages were filled with dense, closely spaced writing, interspersed with illustrations of strange creatures and elaborate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. I leaned closer, squinting at the text, but the language was unfamiliar, the characters twisting and looping in ways that defied any attempt at comprehension. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edge of the page, and felt a sudden jolt, as though the book had recoiled from my touch. The candle flickered violently, the flame sputtering as a cold draft swept through the room, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding, the sense of wrongness growing stronger. It was as if the book were alive, a sentient thing that pulsed with a quiet, malevolent energy, its secrets guarded jealously against prying eyes. I hesitated, torn between the desire to know more and the instinctive urge to leave the room and never return. The book seemed to hum softly, a low, thrumming sound that resonated in the back of my mind, drawing me in despite my better judgment. I flipped through the pages, my movements slow and deliberate, the text and illustrations blurring together in a dizzying whirl of shapes and symbols. There were passages that spoke of hidden realms and ancient rites, of beings that existed beyond the veil of reality, their names unpronounceable and their forms unknowable. It was a compendium of the strange and the forbidden, a chronicle of the impossible. As I read, I became aware of a presence in the room, a quiet, watchful thing that seemed to lurk just beyond the edges of sight. The air grew colder, the candle flickering wildly as the shadows deepened, shifting and twisting like living things. I glanced up, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there, only the books and the dim light, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of pages turning in a non-existent breeze. But the feeling persisted, a creeping sensation of being observed, of something unseen and ancient that watched from the shadows. I closed the book, the cover falling shut with a soft, decisive thud, and stood up, my hands trembling. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the weight of the library's silence a heavy, suffocating presence. I made my way back to the door, my footsteps muted on the stone floor, the air thick with the scent of old paper and candle smoke. I paused at the threshold, casting one last glance at the book that lay on the desk, its dark cover gleaming faintly in the candlelight. For a moment, I considered taking it with me, a souvenir of my strange exploration, but something held me back, a quiet, insistent warning that echoed in the back of my mind. I left the archives and made my way back through the twisting corridors of the library, the familiar sense of unease growing with each step. The silence seemed to follow me, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down, the sense that I had wandered too far, ventured into a place that was not meant to be explored. The books on the shelves seemed to watch as I passed, their spines gleaming faintly in the dim light, the titles unreadable in the gloom. I quickened my pace, eager to leave the library's labyrinthine depths, the strange encounter in the archives a persistent, nagging thought that refused to be dismissed. When I finally emerged into the cool, rain-slicked streets, the city felt different, muted, as though the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. The noise of traffic and the distant hum of voices seemed to fade, replaced by the soft, steady patter of rain on the pavement. I glanced back at the library, its dark silhouette looming against the sky, the windows blank and unresponsive. It stood there, a silent monolith, a keeper of secrets too vast and too strange for any one person to understand. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the library in my thoughts, replaying the events of that afternoon over and over. The book, the strange, shifting illustrations, the feeling of being watched, it all lingered, a quiet, unsettling presence at the edge of my mind. I couldn't shake the sense that I had brushed against something ancient and unknowable, a force that lay just beyond the reach of comprehension. The library, with its endless shelves and darkened alcoves, remained a place of mystery and shadows, a gateway to the forgotten and the forbidden. I never went back to the library, but I often wondered what other secrets it held, hidden away in the countless volumes that lined its shelves. There were moments when I would catch glimpses of it in my dreams, the dim light and the smell of old books, the sense of endless corridors stretching into darkness. And always, at the heart of it all, was the book, the one that lay open on the desk, its pages filled with the strange and the unknowable, waiting patiently for someone brave or foolish enough to read it. And so, the library remains, a forgotten place in a city that has moved on, its doors still open to those who dare to enter. It is a place of quiet whispers and long-forgotten stories. Where the boundaries between reality and the impossible blur, and where the shadows stretch long and deep across the stone floors. And somewhere within its labyrinthine depths, The book waits, its secrets guarded by the silence of the ages, a silent testament to the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of understanding.